At my son's first birthday lunch, my mother-in-law stood up in front of 30 guests, looked directly at my husband, and said, "I don't know why you're celebrating. That child doesn't even look like you." The room went silent. Plates stopped clattering. My husband's hand found mine under the table and squeezed once, a signal I'd learned to recognize as the moment something inside him snapped permanently. By the time the appetizers were cleared, he had already texted his father to cancel the lease on his mother's apartment. By dessert, she had lost her home, her access to the family business, and her grandson, all in the span of a single meal she had planned as a power move. This was the final detonation of a Cold War that began the day my husband introduced me. The woman who stood up at that birthday party didn't lose everything on impulse. She'd been testing boundaries for years, convinced her son would always choose blood over wife. She was wrong, and her miscalculation cost her not just a grandson, but the apartment her son paid for, the family business she'd assumed would be her retirement, and any claim to the family name. This is the story of what happens when a mother-in-law's entitlement collides with a husband's unwavering loyalty, and how one public insult unraveled an entire family's financial architecture in under 2 hours. Because the real question isn't why she said those words. It's what she believed gave her the right. To understand how Florence Lancaster lost her apartment, her access to the family business, and her grandson in the time it takes to finish a birthday lunch, you have to understand what she'd been getting away with for the 8 years before that day. I met Daniel when I was 26. He was managing his father's restaurant supply company in Portland, a business his grandfather had started out of a warehouse on the east side when the city still had working waterfront. By the time I entered his life, Lancaster Provisions had 12 employees, a fleet of refrigerated trucks, and a reputation for reliability that had made the family quietly wealthy. Daniel ran operations while his father, Martin, handled acquisitions. His mother, Florence, had no official role. She hadn't worked a day in the warehouse or the office, but she carried the Lancaster name like a controlling interest in a publicly traded company, and she expected dividends. The first time I had dinner with his parents, Florence hugged me at the door, complimented my dress, and spent the next 90 minutes conducting a performance review disguised as small talk. She asked about my family, my degree, my job as a pediatric nurse. Every answer I gave was received with a tight smile and a deflection back to something about Daniel. His accomplishments, his ex-girlfriends, his preferences. By the time dessert arrived, I had learned that I was not from the right kind of family, that nursing was noble but not particularly ambitious, and that Daniel had once dated a woman named Clarissa who came from money and still sent Christmas cards. None of this was said directly. Florence didn't need directness. She had spent decades refining a communication style that landed like a paper cut, small, precise, and impossible to prove was intentional. Daniel had warned me about her, sort of. "My mom's particular," he'd said in the car on the way over, which is what people say when they've spent their whole lives learning to translate their parents' behavior into words that don't sound like what they actually mean. What he meant was, she will find every exposed seam in your confidence and pull. The apartment was one of those arrangements that made sense on paper. When Martin's mother, Daniel's grandmother, had moved into assisted living 5 years earlier, her 2-bedroom in the Pearl District sat empty. It was fully paid off, part of the family's holdings. Florence decided she wanted it. She told Martin she needed her own space, a place in the city where she could be closer to Daniel, closer to culture, closer to the life she deserved after raising 2 children. Daniel was 24 at the time, already drawing a salary from the business. Without anyone formally asking him, it was understood that he would cover the monthly fees, the association dues, the utilities, the property taxes. Florence called it helping your mother. Martin called it temporary. Daniel called it nothing. He just paid. By the time I moved in with Daniel, he'd been covering that apartment for 6 years. Florence had redecorated twice. She hosted bridge games and wine evenings and one memorable book club meeting that ended with a neighbor calling the police about noise. She treated the apartment as hers, because functionally, legally almost, it was. The deed stayed in the family trust, but Florence had the keys, the mail, the annual holiday party, and her son paid the bills that kept it all running. The arrangement was never a gift. It was a leash, braided from obligation and filial guilt, and Florence held the other end. This is the part of the story where I need to tell you that I tried. I really did. For the first 2 years, I absorbed her comments like a professional. I brought thoughtful gifts to holidays. I remembered her favorite wine, her allergies, her grudges against various extended family members. I let her tell me how Daniel liked his shirts folded and what foods disagreed with his stomach, as if I hadn't been living with the man for 18 months, as if I hadn't already learned his body and his habits in the quiet, daily way that actual partnership teaches you. I nodded through conversations about Clarissa's recent promotion at a tech firm and how lovely her wedding had looked in the magazine spread. I smiled when Florence referred to me as Daniel's friend at a family reunion, a full year after we'd moved in together. The pattern was the same thing over and over, quiet erosion disguised as warmth, a compliment that wasn't quite a compliment, a question that was really an accusation, a boundary crossed so softly you didn't feel it until you turned around and realized you'd given up more ground than you meant to. And through all of it, Daniel was steady. He would squeeze my hand under the dinner table. He would text me afterward, "Ignore her, she's just like that." He would promise to say something next time, and sometimes he did, gently, carefully, in ways Florence dismissed with a wave and a darling, "I'm only trying to help." But the real test hadn't come yet. The test came with a positive pregnancy test and a due date 9 months away. The day we told Florence she was going to be a grandmother, she cried, actual tears. She hugged me for the first time that felt almost genuine and said, "Finally, something I've been praying for." For about 4 days, I let myself believe the baby had changed something. Then the calls started. She wanted to be in the delivery room. She wanted to choose the name. She wanted us to move closer to her apartment because the suburb where we'd bought a house was too far for a grandmother to be expected to drive. When Daniel told her no, to the delivery room, to the name, to the relocation, she stopped calling him for 2 weeks. The silence was a punishment, and he knew it. I watched him check his phone, shoulders tight, waiting for the next message that would either be guilt or forgiveness, and I realized this was a system she'd installed in him decades before I ever entered the picture. The birth was complicated. I won't give you the medical details because that's not what this story is about, but I will tell you that I spent 41 hours in labor, that there was a moment when the monitors started beeping wrong and a team rushed in, and that Daniel stood beside me the entire time, holding my hand with the same grip I'd felt under the table at that first family dinner. Our son was born healthy, 8 pounds, dark hair like his father, a cry that filled the room. We named him Leo after my grandfather, and I remember looking at his face and thinking, nothing else matters. Not Florence, not the years of small cuts, not the apartment or the business or any of it. I had my own family now. Florence visited the hospital 2 days later. She held Leo for about 30 seconds before handing him back and saying, "He's got the Lancaster brow, thank goodness." I was too exhausted to respond. Daniel said nothing, but I saw the look in his eyes change, just for a moment, the way a crack forms in glass before the whole thing shatters. The first year of Leo's life was a series of escalating skirmishes. Florence wanted him baptized in her church. We chose a different denomination. She wanted weekly visits. We offered monthly. She criticized my breastfeeding, my sleep training methods, my decision to go back to work part-time. Every choice I made was interrogated through the lens of her superior maternal experience. Daniel backed me every time, but backing someone isn't the same as stopping the attack. Florence kept coming because she had never encountered a consequence that stuck. The apartment was still hers. The bills still got paid. The business still operated with her name on the family ledger. She had every reason to believe I was temporary, just another woman her son would eventually placate or outlast. And then Leo turned 1, and we planned a party. The guest list was 30 people. The venue was the private room of a restaurant downtown, the kind with exposed brick and big windows and a long table that sat everyone together. I wanted it to be perfect, not for Florence, but for us, for the life we were building. Florence called me the week before to ask what she should wear, a question that wasn't really a question, but a test of whether I'd suggest something appropriate enough. I told her anything she liked. She arrived in a pale pink dress suit, The kind a woman wears when she intends to be photographed holding a baby, and when she walked in, I felt my stomach tighten. This is fine, I told myself. It's one afternoon. It's just cake and presents and people who love us. She can't ruin this. I was wrong. She didn't ruin it quietly. She didn't ruin it with a backhanded comment or an expression of disappointment. She stood up at a table full of 30 witnesses, interrupted Daniel mid-sentence as he was about to make a toast, raised her own glass, and smiled at the room like she was about to deliver a blessing. The look on her face was triumph, pure anticipation. Whatever she was about to say, she'd been holding it in for a long time. Daniel's hand found mine under the table. And then she opened her mouth. The exact words Florence spoke into that silence were, "I don't know why you're celebrating. That child doesn't even look like you." She said it to Daniel while looking at Leo in the high chair beside me. Her tone was light, conversational even, as if she'd just remarked on the weather. For maybe 3 full seconds, no one in that room breathed. Then my mother, who was sitting across from us, set down her fork with a clatter that sounded like a starting pistol. Daniel didn't react immediately. His hand was still wrapped around mine, and I felt his fingers go cold. He looked at his mother with an expression I had never seen before, not anger, not yet. It was recognition, as if he were finally seeing something that had been camouflaged for 34 years. He said, "What did you just say?" And Florence, mistaking his quiet for an opening, repeated herself. "I'm just saying, darling, look at him. You have dark hair and dark eyes." "That baby is fair. I think we're all thinking it." She gestured vaguely around the table, inviting allies. No one moved. The man sitting next to my mother was my father-in-law, Martin. I want to be precise about Martin, because he matters in what happened next. Martin was not a cruel man. He was an absent one. He had spent 40 years letting Florence manage the emotional architecture of their family while he managed the business, and he'd convinced himself those were separate territories. That afternoon, he looked at his wife with something between confusion and horror, but he did not speak. He did not correct her, and that silence was its own verdict. The person who did speak was my husband's younger sister, Andrea. She was 28, a high school science teacher in Seattle, and she had traveled down for this party with a gift wrapped in hand-stamped paper and a card that said "World's Best Nephew" before she even knew me well enough to mean it. Andrea said, "Mom, stop. What is wrong with you?" Florence waved her off. "Oh, Andrea, don't be dramatic. I'm only being honest." That's when I stood up. Not because I had a plan, but because my body decided for me. I lifted Leo from the high chair and held him against my chest. He was warm and confused and starting to fuss. I looked at Florence, and for the first time in 8 years, I did not smile. I did not absorb. I said, "You need to leave." Florence blinked. She looked at Daniel Jr. My husband, her son, the man whose name I had taken, and waited for him to contradict me. It was the same look I'd seen at a dozen dinners, 100 phone calls. It said, "Handle her." It said, "You know who matters here." But Daniel didn't handle me. He stood up beside me, put his arm around my shoulder, and said, "My wife is right. You need to leave, Mom, now." The word, "Mom," landed like a stranger in his mouth, someone he used to know a long time ago. Florence did not leave immediately. She was not the sort of woman who left any room where she believed she still held status. She looked around the table from face to face, searching for an ally, a hesitation, a crack. She found none. Andrea was staring at her plate. Martin was studying the tablecloth. My parents were rigid with fury they were too polite to fully unleash. The other guests, friends from Daniel's company, my nursing colleagues, neighbors, were frozen in the particular silence of people who came for cake and ended up witnessing a family detonation. Florence gathered her purse with exaggerated dignity, pushed back her chair, and said, "Fine, I know when I'm not welcome." She walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and then Daniel picked up his phone. This is the part of the story I need to slow down for, because it's the part most people get wrong when they retell it. They imagine rage. They imagine a dramatic fight, a screaming match, a long simmering grudge that finally boiled over. That's not what happened. What happened was that Daniel opened his text thread with his father, typed a message with the same calm he used to submit purchase orders, and hit send. I saw the text over his shoulder. It read, "Cancel the Pearl District lease, all of it. Effective immediately. She's done." Martin's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it. He looked at his son. A whole conversation passed between them without a single word spoken. Martin had spent decades letting Florence believe the apartment was hers. He'd let Daniel pay the bills every month without ever clarifying that the arrangement was a gift, not an entitlement. He'd built a quiet wall between his wife's behavior and his own conscience, and in that moment, with a text message glowing on his screen and 30 people watching, the wall collapsed. He nodded once. He texted back, "Understood." Just like that, in the time it takes to send 8 words over a cellular network, Florence Lancaster lost her home. But the apartment was only the first domino. To understand what else fell, you need to understand how the Lancaster family business was structured. I learned all of this later, from Daniel, from Andrea, from the documents that surfaced in the weeks that followed. At the time of the party, I only knew the broad strokes. Daniel managed daily operations at Lancaster Provisions. Martin held the controlling interest. Florence was not an owner, not an employee, not even a board member. She was the founder's daughter-in-law, the current owner's wife, the future owner's mother. She had influence without accountability, access without ownership, and for 40 years she had used that position like a weapon she never had to register. There were 2 things Florence cared about more than anything else: status and security. The apartment was security. The business was status. She attended every company holiday party as if she were the guest of honor. She name-dropped Lancaster Provisions at her bridge games and her wine evenings. When a restaurant in town got a good review, she found a way to mention that their produce came from our company. The business was her identity. It was also her retirement plan. Not formally, not legally, but in the unspoken assumption that had governed her marriage for 4 decades. Martin would provide, Daniel would inherit, and Florence would never, ever have to worry about money. That assumption was about to shatter. After the party, after the guests had shuffled out with uncomfortable hugs and murmured sympathies, Daniel and I went home. Leo fell asleep in the car seat. We carried him inside, laid him in his crib, and stood in the nursery in the dark for a long time. Finally, Daniel said, "I need to tell you some things about my family." I sat on the floor of the nursery, my back against the wall, and listened. The Pearl District apartment wasn't just an apartment. It was one piece of a web of financial arrangements that Florence had manipulated over the years. Daniel had been paying the monthly fees since he was 24. He'd also covered the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance. Martin had told him it was temporary, that Florence would eventually downsize, that the arrangement was a favor to his grandmother. But the grandmother had died 3 years earlier. The apartment had stayed. Florence had stayed. And Daniel had kept paying because that's what he'd been trained to do since childhood: absorb the cost, maintain the peace, never ask for anything in return. That training ended in the private room of a restaurant while his mother questioned his son's paternity in front of everyone he loved. But there was more. Florence had credit cards linked to the business accounts. Not officially, she was not an authorized user, but Martin had given her a card years ago for household expenses. And she'd gradually expanded the definition of household to include restaurant meals, boutique shopping, and twice-yearly trips to a spa in Arizona. Daniel had noticed the charges. He'd mentioned them to Martin. Martin had said he'd handle it. He never did. So that night, sitting on the nursery floor with his son sleeping 3 feet away, Daniel sent a second text to his father. "Cut off the cards, every account she's attached to. I want a list of every dollar she's spent from the business in the last 5 years. If you don't do this, I walk, and I'll start a competing company within 6 months." That was the pivot. That was the moment the conflict stopped being about a birthday insult and became about something larger. Daniel wasn't just defending me anymore. He was dismantling a system of financial dependency that his mother had built over decades, a system that had allowed her to treat everyone in her orbit as either a resource or a threat. The apartment was gone. The business access was about to follow. And Florence didn't know yet, sitting alone in her apartment, probably composing a script about how her son had been manipulated by his wife. She still believed this was a temporary rebellion. She still believed her position was unassailable. Martin called the next morning. I could hear his voice through the phone, tired, old-sounding in a way I'd never noticed before. He said, "I've done the cards, I've got the list. It's worse than you think." Daniel put him on speaker. Martin walked through the numbers. Over the previous 5 years, Florence had charged just under $140,000 to accounts connected to Lancaster Provisions. She'd categorized them as marketing, client entertainment, executive travel. There had been no clients. There had been no marketing. There was just Florence, living a life she believed she was entitled to, subsidized by a business she'd never contributed a single hour of labor toward. And Martin had let it happen because confronting her was harder than absorbing the cost. But the cost wasn't just financial. Andrea called that afternoon. She'd been at the party, she'd seen the whole thing, and now she wanted to tell Daniel something she'd been holding back for years. When Andrea was in college, Florence had pulled her aside during a holiday break and said, "You don't need to try so hard. You're pretty enough to marry well. Let your brother handle the business." Andrea had been a biochemistry major with a full scholarship. She'd been planning to apply to medical school. And her mother, the woman who was supposed to champion her potential, had told her to coast on her looks and find a wealthy husband. Andrea had never told Daniel because she'd assumed it wouldn't matter, because she'd assumed he'd defend their mother the way he always had. She was wrong. She was also the one who told us about Clarissa. You remember Clarissa, the ex-girlfriend who came from money, the one Florence still mentioned at holiday dinners. Andrea told us that Florence had been secretly emailing Clarissa for years, updating her about Daniel's life, suggesting that his marriage to me was a phase, implying that Clarissa should stay in touch. Florence had been trying to maintain a backup plan for her son's romantic life, as if I were a temporary contractor who could be replaced when a better candidate became available. Daniel listened to all of this while packing the kitchen. His face was unreadable. When Andrea finished, he said, "Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Then he hung up, opened his laptop, and started drafting a letter to the family attorney. The letter was about the apartment, the credit cards, and something I hadn't expected, the inheritance structure. Lancaster Provisions was held in a trust. The trust documents specified that upon Martin's death or retirement, ownership would transfer to Daniel, with provisions for Andrea, and crucially, a lifetime income allocation for Florence. The allocation was not generous, but it was guaranteed. It had been written that way because Martin had assumed his wife would always be part of the family's core, that no matter how difficult she became, blood would keep the lines open. Daniel's letter requested a revision. The lifetime allocation would be removed. Instead, Florence would receive a fixed settlement, enough to live on, no more, with no ongoing claim to business revenue. The letter was calm, legal, and devastating. It was also, Daniel told me, long overdue. By Monday morning, less than 48 hours after the party, 3 things had happened. The Pearl District Apartments leasehold payments had been canceled. The credit cards linked to any Lancaster Provisions account had been frozen, and a certified letter from the family attorney had been delivered to Florence's door, informing her that the trust was under review and her financial support structure was being reevaluated. She called Daniel 27 times that day. He didn't answer. She called me. I didn't answer either. She left voicemails that started with rage and ended with something that almost sounded like pleading, a progression from "how dare you" to "please, I'm your mother," that tracked the dawning realization that she had finally pushed past the point of no return. But Florence had one card left to play, and it was the card she'd been holding since the moment she first held Daniel as a newborn. She showed up at the Lancaster Provisions office on Tuesday afternoon. She didn't call ahead. She didn't make an appointment. She walked past the front desk, past the receptionist who was too shocked to stop her, and into the conference room where Daniel was meeting with 2 of his largest clients. She was wearing the pink suit from the party. She hadn't washed it. Whether that was intentional or a sign of unraveling, I still don't know. She stood at the head of the table, looked at those clients, and said, "My son is making a terrible mistake. He's being manipulated by his wife, and he's destroying this family. If you do business with him, you're supporting a man who abandons his own mother." And then she smiled, that same triumphant smile from the party, as if she'd just won the argument no one else was having. The clients excused themselves. Daniel walked them to the lobby, apologized, and rescheduled. Then he closed his office door, called his father, and said the words that would redefine the Lancaster family for the next decade. "If she ever sets foot in this building again, I'm filing a restraining order. And if you help her, I'll name you in it." Martin didn't argue. Maybe he was too tired. Maybe he'd finally seen what Daniel had seen at the party, that Florence's love was a transaction, and the bill had come due. Instead, Martin drove to the Pearl District apartment, let himself in with his key, and waited for his wife to come home. When she did, he was sitting at her kitchen table with a folder of documents and a check. What was in that folder, and what Florence did next, is the part of the story that changes everything you think you know about how far a mother-in-law will go to win. Because Florence didn't accept defeat, she escalated. And the next move she made didn't just threaten Daniel's business or our marriage, it threatened our son. The letter arrived by certified mail on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the party. It was from an attorney Florence had hired in secret 2 months before Leo was born. Not a family lawyer, not a mediator. A litigator who specialized in grandparents' rights cases, the kind of attorney who builds files before anyone knows there's a war. The letter demanded immediate court-ordered visitation, alleged that I was systematically alienating Daniel from his family of origin, and stated that Florence had grave concerns about Leo's welfare in our household. It was 14 pages long. It cited statutes, referenced psychological studies, and included a bullet-point timeline of every interaction Florence had documented since the day we announced the pregnancy. She'd been keeping a dossier on me for almost 2 years. Daniel read the letter 3 times. Then he called his father and said, "Did you know about this?" Martin's silence was the answer. He hadn't known about the letter specifically, but he knew Florence had been looking into her options after the apartment cancellation. He'd assumed it was talk. He'd assumed she'd calm down. He'd spent 40 years assuming Florence would eventually calm down, and every single time he'd been wrong. "I'll handle it," Martin said, the same words he'd used about the credit cards, about the apartment, about every boundary his wife had ever stomped across. "You're not handling anything," Daniel replied. "You've never handled anything. You've just waited for someone else to absorb the cost. That ends now." Before we could respond to the letter, before our attorney could draft a single reply, the knock came. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was home with Leo, folding laundry on the living room floor while he stacked blocks and knocked them over. Through the window, I saw an unmarked sedan and a woman in a navy blazer walking up our front path with a clipboard. She wasn't a delivery driver. She wasn't a neighbor. I opened the door and she said, "Mrs. Lancaster." "I'm Angela Cross from the Department of Child Services. We've received a report regarding your son's safety, and I need to conduct a home visit." She showed her identification. My legs went cold in a way I've never felt before or since. The report, I learned later, had been filed by Florence Lancaster. She'd called the hotline the day after the office confrontation, identifying herself as a concerned grandmother. She told the intake worker that her daughter-in-law was emotionally unstable, that she'd witnessed erratic behavior at the birthday party, that she feared for the child's safety due to parental alienation and possible substance use. She'd used my nursing credentials against me, suggesting I had access to medication. She'd painted a picture of a mother unraveling, a father controlled and passive, a baby in danger. Every word was a lie. Every word was chosen to trigger an investigation. And because the system must respond to all reports, an investigation is what we got. That first visit lasted 3 hours. Ms. Cross walked through every room. She checked the refrigerator, the smoke detectors, the crib slats. She asked about Leo's pediatrician, his milestones, his sleeping arrangements. She asked if I'd ever been treated for depression or anxiety, if there were firearms in the house, if Daniel and I fought. Leo sat on my lap, oblivious, chewing a teething ring, while I answered questions designed to determine whether I was fit to keep my own child. I answered calmly. I showed her medical records, daycare reports, photos of Leo at every stage. I explained that the caller was my mother-in-law, that we were in the middle of a family dispute, that the allegations were retaliation for financial boundaries we'd set. Ms. Cross took notes. Her face gave nothing away. When Daniel came home and saw the CPS card on the kitchen counter, he stopped moving mid-step. I told him what happened. He sat down at the table, put his head in his hands, and stayed there for a long time. Then he stood up, walked to his office, and called the one person in Portland who could handle what was coming. Her name was Alina Vasquez, and she was a family law attorney who'd spent 15 years dealing with high-conflict custody cases and false CPS reports. She'd seen mothers-in-law weaponize the system before. She'd seen grandparents file for custody out of spite. She wasn't shocked. She was prepared. She said, This happens more than anyone talks about. The system can be used as a bludgeon. We're going to shut it down." That call cost us a $5,000 retainer and was worth every penny. But here's what we didn't know yet. What made this worse than a single false report? While the CPS investigation was pending, while I was still waking up every morning terrified that someone might knock on my door and take my son, we started getting phone calls from my colleagues at the hospital. Florence hadn't stopped with child services. She'd mailed a letter to the nursing director of every pediatric unit in the Portland metro area. The letter claimed I was showing signs of substance abuse and erratic behavior, that I'd been observed in public in a disoriented state, that the hospital should review my patient files for any irregularities. She'd signed it as a concerned family member. She'd copied the state nursing board. Within a week, I was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. My career, the thing I'd built through years of night shifts and certifications and carefully earned trust, was now under review because my mother-in-law had decided to burn my life down to save her rent-free apartment. Daniel came with me to the meeting with the hospital's human resources director. I brought character references from supervisors, my clean disciplinary record, performance reviews going back 5 years. I brought the CPS caseworker's preliminary notes, which already indicated the allegations appeared unfounded. I brought the letter from Florence's attorney, the one demanding visitation, which proved a pattern of escalating harassment. The HR director listened. She reviewed everything. She said, "I've seen family disputes spill into workplaces, but this is a new level. We're closing the investigation. You're reinstated immediately." She walked us out and added quietly, "You might want to consult a defamation attorney." We already had. Elena Vasquez connected us with a civil litigator named Thomas Park. He was in his 50s, calm as a pond, and when he read Florence's letters and the CPS report and the timeline of events, he said 4 words that changed the course of everything. "This is criminal harassment." He explained that false reporting to CPS could be charged as a misdemeanor, but when combined with the employment interference and the pattern of threats, it rose to a level the district attorney might take seriously. He asked if we wanted to pursue charges. Daniel looked at me. I looked at him. Leo was in the next room with a sitter, building block towers, blissfully unaware that his grandmother had tried to have him removed from our home just to prove a point. I said, "Yes." That decision to press charges was the turning point, not just legally, but emotionally. For years, Daniel had been the buffer between his mother's chaos and everyone else. He'd absorbed her behavior, redirected it, minimized it, paid the bills to keep it quiet. Pressing charges meant admitting, finally and publicly, that his mother was not just difficult, she was dangerous. That shift cracked something open in him, and what came out was years of memories he'd compartmentalized and labeled as normal. He told me about the time she'd fired a nanny when he was 8 because the nanny had encouraged him to try soccer instead of piano. He told me about the credit card she'd opened in his name when he was 19, maxed out on clothes and spa treatments, and paid off only after his father intervened. He told me about Clarissa again, not the Christmas cards, but the fact that Florence had convinced Clarissa to break up with Daniel 6 years earlier by telling her he had a commitment problem, and that he'd never be able to give her the life she deserved. Florence had sabotaged his relationships, his finances, his childhood, all while framing herself as a devoted mother. And then Andrea called with the worst revelation of all. She'd been going through old family files. Martin had finally given her access to the trust documents, and she'd found something. 22 years earlier, when Daniel was 12, his paternal grandmother had tried to establish a college fund for him. Not a small one. $50,000 seeded from her own investments. Florence had blocked it, not by legal challenge, but by social manipulation. She'd convinced Martin's mother that Daniel didn't need extra pressure, and that the money would be better held in a family trust where we can all access it if needed. The money was gone by the time Daniel turned 18, spent, Andrea discovered, on a second property in Florence's name that she'd sold 5 years later at a loss. Daniel had never known. Martin had never told him. The silence in our kitchen when Daniel processed this was the heaviest sound I've ever heard. The CPS investigation concluded 4 weeks after it began. The report was officially marked unfounded, no evidence of neglect or abuse. The caseworker told me, in a phone call I will never forget, "Mrs. Lancaster, I've done this job for 11 years, and I want you to know that this report should never have been filed. The allegations were not just false, they were malicious. I flagged the filing party in our system." She couldn't tell me what that meant practically, but Alina Vasquez knew. It meant Florence's name was now on a list of reporters who had filed a substantiated false allegation. It meant any future report from her would be met with extreme skepticism. It meant the weapon she'd tried to use against us had been taken out of her hands. The nursing board investigation closed without action. My reinstatement letter arrived on a Friday. I went back to work the following Monday, walking into the pediatric unit with my badge clipped to my scrubs and something new in my posture. My coworkers had known, the rumors had circulated, but they'd also known me. They'd seen me stay calm during codes, comfort terrified parents, advocate for patients who couldn't speak. They knew who I was. Florence had tried to destroy that identity with a letter, and she'd failed. What she didn't understand, what she'd never understood, was that people who actually knew me could tell the difference between a lie and the truth. The legal front expanded. Thomas Park filed a civil complaint for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The district attorney's office picked up the criminal harassment charge. A court date was set. Florence was served papers at her apartment, the one she was being evicted from, because without Daniel's payments, the arrears had piled up, and Martin had finally, after decades, refused to pay them. She called Daniel from a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered, she was crying not the performative crying she used to guilt him, but something rawer, less controlled. "You're really going to put your mother in jail?" she asked. "You're really going to choose her over your own blood?" Daniel's response was quiet and final. "I'm not choosing between you and my wife. I'm choosing between my son's safety and your abuse. That's not a choice, that's an obligation." The week before the hearing, Florence posted a 4,000-word essay on a public social media account. She framed herself as a grieving grandmother, a mother abandoned by her son, a woman punished for speaking truth. She didn't mention the birthday party, the CPS report, the letters to my employer, the college fund she'd stolen. She mentioned her apartment, her stolen access to the family business, her financial vulnerability. She used phrases like cancel culture and family values. The post was shared by people who didn't know us, people who saw an older woman in distress and filled in the blanks with their own histories. For 3 days, strangers on the internet called us monsters. Old friends of Florence's sent Daniel messages asking how he could treat his mother this way. One of them showed up at Lancaster Provisions with a petition. The receptionist turned her away, but the damage was done. Our address, our phone numbers, our son's name were all out in the world now, weaponized by a woman who would rather destroy her family publicly than admit she was wrong. But Florence didn't realize that in going public, she had just handed us the weapon we needed to finish this. Because now, the whole world was about to see what happened when an entitled mother-in-law tried to destroy her son's family and failed. And what happened next, in the courtroom, in the business, in the final unraveling of everything Florence Lancaster had spent 40 years building, was the part of the story that turns a family conflict into a reckoning. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in November, 11 weeks after the birthday party. Florence arrived wearing the same pink suit, as if she believed the outfit still held power. She didn't come alone. She'd found a group, a loose coalition of online supporters who'd read her social media essay and decided she was a victim of generational cruelty. They sat in the gallery behind her, 3 women and 1 man, all strangers, armed with notebooks, and a sense of moral purpose that had been assembled entirely from one side of a story they'd never bothered to verify. Florence kept turning to smile at them, a pageant wave disguised as gratitude. She still thought she was the protagonist. The first thing that went wrong for her was the CPS report. The caseworker, Ms. Cross, was called as a witness, not by us, but by the district attorney. She took the stand and read her findings into the record. Investigation unfounded, no evidence of neglect, allegations determined to be knowingly false. She used the word malicious. She confirmed that Florence's name had been flagged in the system for filing a fictitious report. The supporters in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. One of them checked her phone. Florence's smile tightened, but she didn't break. She didn't break until our attorney called Andrea. Florence had not expected her daughter to testify against her. Andrea had driven down from Seattle that morning, arriving at the courthouse in a dark suit with a folder of documents and an expression I can only describe as grief hardened into purpose. She took the stand, swore to tell the truth, and then told the court about the college fund. $50,000, blocked by Florence, drained into a property that was later sold at a loss. She had the trust records, the transfer statements, the deed with Florence's signature. She also had the emails, the ones Florence had sent to Clarissa over the years. Andrea read one aloud. "Daniel's current situation is temporary. I give it 2 years. Keep yourself available." The courtroom was silent. One of the supporters in the gallery got up and left. Then came the defamation testimony. Thomas Park presented the letter Florence had sent to my employer, the one that triggered my administrative leave. He presented the CPS hotline call transcript, obtained through the investigation, in which Florence described me as unstable and possibly medicating. He presented the social media post, which had been shared more than 11,000 times and which named me, my workplace, and my son. The post was still live. Florence had not taken it down. Elena Vasquez asked for sanctions. The judge looked at Florence over her reading glasses and said, "Mrs. Lancaster, I don't think you understand the position you're in." Florence's attorney, the litigator she'd hired to pursue grandparents' rights, had withdrawn 2 days before the hearing. He'd been retained on a false premise, that I was unstable, that Daniel was controlled, that Leo was at risk. When the CPS report came back unfounded, when the nursing board closed its investigation, when he saw the evidence Thomas Park had compiled, he filed a motion to withdraw, citing irreconcilable differences with the client's objectives. What that meant in plain English was that even her own lawyer realized she was lying. She stood in the courtroom that morning representing herself, clutching a binder of handwritten notes, still believing she could argue her way back into power. She could not. The criminal harassment charge was pleaded down to a misdemeanor, not out of mercy, but because Daniel asked the prosecutor not to pursue jail time. His reasoning was practical. Jail would make her a martyr to her online following. Instead, she received probation, a fine, a permanent no-contact order protecting me and Leo, and a legal finding that would follow her permanently. The defamation case was settled separately. Florence agreed to remove the social media post and issue a written retraction. Thomas Park drafted the retraction language. It was 3 sentences long and contained no apologies, only admissions. "I made allegations against my daughter-in-law that were not true. I filed a report with Child Services that was not based in fact. I regret the harm I caused." She signed it. 5 minutes later, Martin filed the revised trust documents. This was the final piece, the one that turned financial leverage from a weapon into a verdict. The revised Lancaster Trust removed Florence's lifetime allocation entirely. In its place was a single lump sum settlement, $200,000, dispersed immediately, with no further claim to any business revenue, property, or assets held by the trust. It was not nothing. It was enough to live on for a few years if she managed it carefully. But it was a fraction of what she'd spent over the previous decade. The credit cards alone had totaled nearly $140,000, and it came with a condition. If she violated the no-contact order, if she attempted to approach Leo, Daniel, or me, if she filed another false report, the settlement would be voided and she would receive nothing. The document was irrevocable. Her signature was already on it, because Martin had told her the alternative was litigation that would drain whatever was left. She signed it on the same day she signed the eviction notice for the Pearl District apartment. That apartment had been her status symbol for 11 years. She'd hosted bridge games and wine evenings and book club meetings that ended with police calls. She'd redecorated twice, bought furniture on credit cards linked to the business, and told everyone in her social circle that the apartment was a gift from her son. When the eviction process concluded, the building manager told Martin it took 3 days to clear everything out. Florence didn't hire movers. She refused to believe it was happening until the sheriff's deputy arrived. She left behind a chandelier she'd installed without permission and a water stain on the hardwood from a plant she'd overwatered. The apartment was sold 6 months later. The proceeds went into the trust, into Andrea's allocation, into Leo's college fund, a detail I learned from Martin at a quiet dinner we had after everything settled. He seemed lighter, I noticed. Older, but lighter. As if he'd been carrying a weight he'd forgotten, was there, until someone finally took it off his shoulders. Lancaster Provisions never felt the disruption Florence had hoped for. The clients who'd witnessed her office invasion, the ones she'd tried to turn against Daniel, not only stayed, they increased their orders. One of them, a restaurant group owner named Kevin Chen, told Daniel privately, "I've got a mother-in-law too. You handled that better than most." Word traveled in the Portland food community, not as scandal, but as quiet respect. Daniel had protected his family. He'd refused to bend. In a business built on relationships, that kind of integrity mattered. Within a year, Lancaster Provisions had added 4 new accounts and promoted a warehouse manager to handle the expansion Daniel had been too distracted to pursue, while his mother's drama consumed his attention. My career survived. The internal investigation closed with an official finding of no misconduct, and my file was cleared. But the experience changed something in me. I'd always been a private person, a nurse who did her job, cared for her patients, and kept her life outside the hospital separate from her life inside it. After the letter, after the CPS visit, after seeing how easily someone who'd never worked a shift in my unit could threaten everything I'd built, I started talking. Not publicly, not on social media, but to colleagues, to young nurses who were dealing with family pressure, to new mothers who were being undermined by in-laws. The stories I heard in return made my jaw tighten. Grandmothers threatening to sue for visitation, mothers-in-law showing up at workplaces, false reports filed out of spite. It was an epidemic hiding in plain sight, and nobody talked about it because the victims were ashamed, as if being targeted meant they'd done something wrong. This is the thing I want to pause on before this story closes. What Florence did was not unique. The details were hers: the birthday party, the apartment, the business, the 40 years of unearned privilege, but the pattern is everywhere. Grandparent estrangement affects 1 in 4 families. Nearly 80% of estranged mothers believe a son or daughter-in-law turned their child against them, rarely considering that their own behavior might be the cause. The generational divide is real. Older parents often view family bonds as permanent and non-negotiable, while younger adults increasingly see mental health and boundary setting as non-negotiable themselves. The clash is almost inevitable, and when it comes, the ones who lose are almost always the ones who refuse to adapt. Florence moved to Arizona after the settlement. She bought a small condo near the spa she used to visit on the company credit card, a detail that Martin noted with the exhausted irony of a man who'd finally stopped pretending his wife was capable of change. She sends cards on Leo's birthday. They are not delivered to our house. Andrea intercepts them, reads them to make sure they contain no threats, and files them in a folder we'll probably never open. Leo is 4 now. He knows his Aunt Andrea, his grandpa Martin, his cousins and playmates and preschool teachers. He does not know his grandmother Florence. The no-contact order remains in place. The settlement holds. The trust is structured so that he will never have to absorb the cost of someone else's entitlement. The single meal that unraveled everything, that birthday lunch, with its 30 guests and its pink suit and its public insult, is now a story we tell ourselves when we need to remember what we survived. It is also a story I tell you now, because the final surprise in all of this, the detail that still catches me off guard, is not what Florence lost. It's what we gained. Daniel and I came through that year with something stronger than a marriage. We came through with proof that he would choose us. Proof that I could withstand an attack designed to destroy me. Proof that love, the real kind, doesn't just protect you, it draws a line and holds it, no matter who's on the other side. And if this story has reached you at a moment when you are standing at your own version of that line, wondering whether you have the right to draw it, wondering whether blood really is thicker than self-respect, wondering whether the guilt they've trained into you is actually obligation or just a long con dressed up as love, then the most important part of what happened next is still ahead. Because after the courtroom, after the eviction, after the settlement and the retraction and the years of silence, someone else reached out. Someone who had been watching. Someone whose story might just change how you see your own. The woman who reached out after the courtroom was a stranger named Jessica, who'd read about our case in a local news brief and recognized her own mother-in-law in every detail. Her story was different in the specifics: no family business, no Pearl District apartment, but identical in the architecture. The public humiliation, the husband caught between loyalty and guilt. The threatened grandparent rights, the whispered accusations, the slow dawning realization that what she'd treated as personality was actually predation. Jessica had been told she was crazy for wanting space. She'd been told that cutting off a grandparent was cruel, unnatural, an overreaction. She'd believed it until she watched another mother draw the same line and survive. "I thought I was the only one," she wrote in her first message. "I thought I was the problem." That sentence could have been mine 6 years earlier. This is what nobody tells you about standing up to a mother-in-law like Florence. The hardest part isn't the confrontation. It isn't the legal fees or the CPS visits or the awkward conversations with relatives who'd rather pretend everything is fine. The hardest part is the years you spent before the line, absorbing damage you'd been conditioned to call love, telling yourself that if you were just more patient, more flexible, more skilled at managing her moods, the problem would disappear. When the problem was never yours to manage. When the problem was an entire family system designed to protect one person's feelings at the expense of everyone else's sanity. Research tells us that more than a quarter of young adults are estranged from at least one parent, and nearly 80% of estranged mothers believe their child's spouse is to blame. But the numbers don't capture the texture of it. The way a woman can dominate a room full of people with a smile and a compliment that curdles in your stomach hours later. The way money and housing and business access become levers, not gifts. The way a grandchild becomes a battleground because the grandmother sees the baby not as a person, but as a fresh source of supply, a new audience for her performance of importance. If any part of that description feels familiar, you're not alone, and you're not overreacting. The research is clear. Emotional abuse is the most common reason adult children cite for cutting off a parent, and emotional abuse doesn't require bruises. It just requires a pattern, sustained over time, that teaches you your feelings don't count. Daniel and I were lucky, if you can call it that. We had the resources to fight back, an attorney who knew the playbook, a business that survived the sabotage, a marriage that bent but didn't break. Not everyone has those things. Some people lose their jobs, their reputations, their custody battles, because someone with more money and less conscience weaponized a system that was supposed to protect families. That's why I'm telling this story now, even though every fiber of my instinct says to keep it private. Because privacy is a privilege that abusers rely on. Silence is the soil their behavior grows in. So here is the question I want to leave with you, the one that didn't make it into any of the legal documents, but is still the most important one we answered. What would have happened if Daniel had stayed silent? If he'd squeezed my hand under the table, and then afterward in the car said, "That's just how she is. Let it go." The answer isn't theoretical. The answer is that Florence would still have her rent-free apartment and her business credit cards and her unchallenged access to our lives. She would have continued escalating, because that's what happens when boundaries collapse. The person who tests them doesn't stop testing, they just find the next weak point. And my son, our Leo, would have grown up watching his grandmother undermine his mother and his father absorb it, learning, as Daniel once learned, that love means never saying no. So if this story has reached you at a moment when you are holding your own line, wondering if you're strong enough to keep it, here is what I know now that I didn't know before the birthday party. The line is not cruelty. The line is not betrayal. The line is the clearest form of love there is. It says, "I will protect what matters, even from people who share my blood." It says, "I will teach my children that respect is non-negotiable and that no one, not a boss, not a partner, not a grandmother, gets to treat them as less than whole." That line, once drawn and held, doesn't just change one family. It changes what the next generation believes is normal. Pause this video for just a second. Tell me in the comments what time it is, where you're watching from, and whether you've ever had to draw a line like this in your own life. I read those comments, and I know from the messages I've received since this story went public that the people who find these videos are often in the middle of their own private reckoning. You don't have to share details. Just knowing you're out there, In cities and time zones I'll probably never visit, holding steady in the face of pressure that most people refuse to name, that matters. That's the whole point. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Share this video with someone who's been told they're crazy for wanting boundaries. Send it to the friend whose mother-in-law keeps showing up uninvited, whose guilt feels louder than their self-respect, whose partner is still trying to play peacekeeper at the expense of their marriage. Somebody needs to hear this today, and it might not be who you think. Our team at Revenge Nickel is dedicated to creating meaningful, emotionally rich storylines that reflect real-life family conflicts and personal struggles. All stories on this channel are entirely fictional and are crafted with the sole purpose of delivering valuable lessons and positive educational messages to our viewers. This script highlights the importance of spousal loyalty, the right to set boundaries with family, and the reality that financial dependence can be used as a weapon and reclaimed as a consequence. Through this story, audiences are reminded that the family you build is worth protecting, that silence is not peace, and that sometimes the strongest thing a husband can do is stand beside his wife and say the one word entitlement never expects to hear: enough.